everyone, and welcome to Middle Ground Book Fest. I am Erin Entrada Kelly, author of several middle grade books for children, including Hello Universe, which received the 2018 Newbery Medal, and We Dream of Space, which received a 2021 Newbery Honor. If you want to get to know me better, you can visit my website at erinentradakelly.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Erin Entrada. My social media accounts are kid and classroom friendly. Before we begin, I would like to give a brief visual description for those who may be able to hear us but not see us. I'm a Filipino-American woman with long dark hair and bangs, and I'm currently sitting in my workspace in North Delaware, surrounded by colorful art, lots of books, of course, and numerous Star Trek collectibles. I'm honored to share the screen with four incredible, accomplished middle grade authors. So authors, please feel free to give a quick wave hello as I introduce you. First, we have Laurel Snyder. Laurel is the author of many books for children, including the Geisel-winning Charlie and Mouse and Orphan Island, which was longlisted for the National Book Award in 2017. A Baltimore native, she lives in Atlanta and teaches in the MFAC program at Hamline University, where we are colleagues, I'm proud to say. You can visit her online at laurelsnyder.com or follow her on Twitter at Laurel Snyder. Next, we have Ronald L Smith. Ron is an award-winning writer of children's literature, including the novels Black Panther, The Young Prince, The Mesmerist, The Owls Have Come to Take Us Away, and Gloomtown. His first novel, Hoodoo, earned him the 2016 Coretta Scott King New Talent Author Award. His latest projects are two new Black Panther novels from Marvel and Where the Black Flowers Bloom, a fantasy based on African folklore and myths. Best book titles, really. Lisa Moore Ramee was born and raised in Los Angeles and now lives in Northern California with her husband, two kids, one obnoxious cat, and a sweet dog. She is the author of A Good Kind of Trouble and Something to Say. Mapmaker, a middle grade fantasy, will be out in 2022. Last but certainly not least, we have Anika Fajardo. Anika was born in Colombia and raised in Minnesota. Her debut middle grade novel, What If a Fish, was awarded the 2021 Minnesota Book Award. Her next book for young readers, Meet Me Halfway, will be published in spring 2022. She has earned awards from the Minnesota State Arts Board, the Jerome Foundation, and the Loft Literary Center. So I want to welcome all of these incredible authors to the virtual stage, and I want to welcome all of you who are viewing and listening. So we're here today to discuss abandoned manuscripts. At school visits, kids often ask me, have you ever started a book that you didn't finish? And it's such an interesting question because as published authors, most of the conversations we have are about books that we have on the shelves, books that we have published. But most writers, including me, have manuscripts that they've abandoned, books that may or may not ever see the light of day. Most of mine, for example, are, well, one thing that they all share in common is that they are all outside of my typical genre. So 7 of my 8 novels are realistic fiction. That's kind of my home base where I feel comfortable. And almost all of my abandoned manuscripts are thrillers or horror or gothic fiction, or they have anthropomorphic animals. And these are all genres that I love to read. But for whatever reason, when I try to write the manuscripts, they aren't successful in many ways. So I wanted to bring this group together to talk about abandoned manuscripts and just like, let's put this conversation out there. Because I think, young readers, young writers, and educators and, book lovers in general are interested in those books that we have kind of languishing on our desktops or in our desk drawers. So I'm going to start with you, Laurel. Tell us about some of your abandoned manuscripts. Do they have anything in common like mine?
So I such an interesting, first of all, thank you for having me. And it's such an interesting topic. And at first it's funny, my first instinct was like, are people interested in the books that don't make it? And then I found myself thinking about like songwriters that I love and like how excited I get if they turn up a new Bruce Springsteen song that was never recorded, that was like an outtake. And I was like, oh yeah, like it like completes the picture, right? Like it fleshes out the music you do love or that you have heard. So I think for me, I have often had these conversations sort of privately with other authors and realized that I'm extreme in this way. And I think I have lots and lots and lots of unpublished manuscripts, and many of them I've given up on them sort of for now. But my approach to them is that I think of them never as completely abandoned. Like, it's important to me that my later self may be smart enough to figure out the things that my now self or my past self hasn't been able to figure out. So I wanted to show you guys really quickly. This is a book of picture book manuscripts that don't exist. I think I have 80 in here right now, but there are more than that. Like, that's just like, you know, it hasn't been updated recently. I started out as a poet, and I've been writing since I was a little girl. And certainly I have abandoned manuscripts from when I was like 10 or 12 or 14 or 16. But I think that there's something about starting out in poetry that, like, when you're a poet, you don't expect everything to find a home. Like, it doesn't have that same kind of, like, if you sit down and work on a novel for 3 years, you're going to spend at least 3 years trying to send that book out and get it published. But if you write poetry every day, it's really, really hard to place poetry. You can't sell poetry. So you write it for yourself. And the expectation is that maybe someday you'll put something together and do a book and send it out, but that, like, you write them for yourself, you write them to explore. And so that was sort of my mentality for so long. So I think that then I shifted that over to picture books. Like, if I have an idea, I kind of throw it down on the page, and I may or may not revise it. I may or may not show it to anybody. I may or may not take it seriously. It's for me to play with. And so, you know, I'll play with an idea, and then 2 years later, I'll play with a similar idea in a different way, or sort of try to come at it from a different direction. So I have lots of abandoned manuscripts, but I don't exactly think of them that way. I think of them as works in progress, or sort of like process pieces. And I would say the exception to that is my genre that I really struggle with is I've really, really wanted to write a chapter book, something in between a picture book or an early reader like Charlie and Mouse, and then a middle grade novel. And for whatever reason, it either gets too big and becomes a novel, or it like doesn't have enough in it for a chapter book. Like, it's a picture book or it's a novel. I can't seem to find that space in the middle. So I have a good four or five like completed revised chapter books that I'm just not happy enough with to send out. And then I'll keep at it. I'm going to keep at it. But
that's a very difficult.
It's so hard. It's
that
like the minute you build the world out. Yeah. The minute you build the world out at all, it like suddenly gets too big, right?
Yes.
So.
And you know what? I have actually folders on my computer where they're labeled like sleeping and dead. So dead means I'm never going to work on this again, but I'm not going to throw it away because you never know, which kind of makes it sound like they're sleeping. And then the other folder is sleeping. So it's like, maybe I'll come back to you. You're just sleeping. They've been asleep for a long time.
I have something similar, but then I also have a folder of basically like sort of the beginnings of ideas that I haven't gotten to yet. So like where like I'll start, like I have this weird verse novel Sylvia Plath project that I want to do that like I don't really write YA, I don't really write verse novels, but I have this sort of interesting idea. So I'll sort of put a bunch of stuff in a document and then realize I don't have the patience for it right now, or I don't have the time for it right now, and like put that in the like books to write later club.
Yes, that makes total sense. Okay, so what about you, Ron? What does your abandoned manuscript folder look like?
There we are. Hey, yeah, okay. So lots of really bad fantasy, Tolkien ripoffs, you know, and the first, actually, there's so many. They're more like learning experiences, right? It's like you're trying to learn how to write, and sometimes you finish them, but you just know they're bad, but you did learn something along the way. That's how I feel the whole idea of abandoned manuscripts go. I've got a bunch of them. They're so bad. And like I say, most of them are kind of traditional, typical European-centric fantasy novels, because that's what I grew up with. You know, so it's like, I need a wizard, I need elves, I need dwarves, you know, and it's like, well, why am I writing in this European tradition? You know, there's so many other cultures, because, you know, I grew up reading that kind of stuff, and that's what you write, you know, that's the default, right? So I had lots of different things, but I would try to create new creatures or new ways to write about the same tropes, like I had something, it was called The Glimmerlings and the Book of Sleep. And it was the first novel. I actually finished it, but I mean, it didn't go anywhere. So I guess it is abandoned. But it was about these kids who were like half fairy, like half fae. And I think I was writing traditional type stories, but trying to find new creatures to put in there. Like, okay, has anybody done anything with pixies, or has anybody done anything with, I don't know, just make up funny, weird creatures. So that's mostly what it's been for me, a real learning experience when I think about abandoned manuscripts. I do have another one. I'm going to save this little story for later because I think you may ask us about it. But I do have a little story about another abandoned manuscript that I want to get to, but I don't want to give it away right now. But most of them have been, like I said, learning experiences, 50, 100 pages that aren't going anywhere of fantasies. I write like supernatural kind of horror fiction, I guess. Not everything's horror, but most of my stories have a supernatural bent. And sometimes I think I did try something that was completely contemporary, but it just did not work. I wanted something traumatic to happen, a demon's got to show up or something like that. So I tried just doing something contemporary, and it just it's not for me. It's not for me. I can't.
That's so interesting.
But I don't know.
Well, because you had the opposite thing that I did, right? Because I've tried to do the supernatural and the dark and the gothic, and it just didn't work for whatever reason. And I think what you said too about trying to figure out a different way to approach something, that really resonated with me. Because, for example, I love time travel books. I haven't actually time traveled yet, but I love the books. And I really want to write a time travel. I love science fiction in general, but I really love time travel. And I've tried to force, when something feels forced, I feel like that's when a lot of manuscripts are abandoned too.
Right.
I sit there and I think, I want to write a book where there's time travel. And then I try to think of what I can do. But I feel like everything has been done. Obviously, that's not true because there's always new things coming out that are exciting with time travel. But I feel like my brain is just not, every idea I would conjure up has already been written. Okay, maybe she goes back in time and meets her mom. Okay, that book was written. You know what I mean? Maybe, I don't know.
Go back in time and meet yourself. Ooh.
Well, we need to discuss that because that could mess up a lot of things, Rod, depending on what time travel community you want to go with. You can't meet yourself. The universe will implode. So yeah, a lot of that really resonated with me. And so this is an interesting segue to Lisa, because Lisa has 2 realistic contemporary novels out, and your next one is a fantasy. So I'm curious, what do you have a stack of abandoned contemporary realistic fiction and a stack of abandoned fantasy? What does your stack look like?
Oh, absolutely. I have stacks of lots of things. And I think partly too is that for a long time I was trying to get published, right? So I was writing the book that was going to be the one that got me an agent and got me published, and then it didn't. And so then I wrote another one. And then, so I look back at those, and some of those I still am like, maybe it could work. I don't know. I think the thing where I know it absolutely would go into your dead folder, which I'm totally going to copy that, Erin, and have Sleeping in Dead now on my computer, is if it's very specific time focused. So I wrote a book that I thought was fantastic about sexting. It was the buzz were everyone was talking about it. I think my kids were, I don't know how old they were, but they were young enough where I was terrified of the idea of it. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to write this book. And I guess no one liked it. It didn't go anywhere. And, I'll never know. It's well, maybe it was just really poorly written. But it's something where it's well, it's too late now. Nobody wants a sexting book now. That's just not something that's current. But the books that I feel are my abandoned manuscripts, because I just don't seem to nail the voice in this area, is the YA stuff. So I love contemporary. I love fantasy. I think that I like swinging back and forth between those two genres. I love horror also, but that's I'm similar to you, Erin, in that like I'm like, I read a ton of it and I see what the writer is doing, and yet I can't do it. Like I don't know how to scare myself. Like I try to write. I'm like, well, how do I know if the scene is scary? Because I know whether or not they're gonna make their way out of it. So I find it very challenging to write horror or to write anything that is supposed to be really funny. Because same thing, I'm like, is this funny? I can't tell if this is funny. But the YA voice is tricky. And I really thought that I was going to be a YA author. And I did something that you're told you're not supposed to do. When I was trying to find an agent, I was actually I was querying 2 books at the same time. And they say, don't do that. And I'm like, well, why not? Like, it's in my best interest. So I was querying a YA thriller and querying a middle grade contemporary. And I figured, well, depending on which one got me an agent, that's the author I would become. And I have to say, I'm really grateful that it was the middle grade contemporary that landed me the agent, because I still sometimes, I think about that YA thriller that is in my sleeping folder. And I think, I don't know if I have another one of those in me. So it would have been really frightening if that had been the one that got published and suddenly people were asking me for more of those. So that's the thing. I think that when I think about abandoning a manuscript, it's really the stuff where I'm like, I just can't. It's kind of like what Laurel and Ron have already said. I just can't quite figure out how to get that story to work in a way that makes sense. And so I put it away. Every once in a while, I will feel like, ooh, this has a really good paragraph. And I steal it and drop it into a book that had nothing to do with that. But I was just like, oh, it was a really good description of something, and I will use it. So that's my shameful abandoned story.
Well, I've had trouble with the YA voice as well. I've tried to write YA, and Laurel, you mentioned this, and it just doesn't. I don't know if it's because I'm so not wanting to revisit my teen years. I mean, not that I want to revisit my middle school years. So I don't know if that's not even an excuse that makes sense. But I will say this, Lisa, I'm sure your sexting book is amazing, and the public just wasn't ready for it. That's what it was. It was too good. That was the problem. Okay. Anika, what about you? What is your abandoned sleeping/dead folder look like? Is it a mess?
Well, my story is actually kind of a lot like Lisa's. I actually became a middle grade writer because of an abandoned manuscript. I started writing a memoir 12 years ago. I was 100% a creative nonfiction writer, and I would send it out every 3 years, and then one version, and then I would, somebody would tell me to rewrite it in a different way. And so I was writing and kind of, learning how to write at the same time. And then so this was 12 years ago. So then about 4 or 5 years ago, I was like, no, clearly this book, which I've rewritten a million times, is dead, and it's going to go in that dead folder, whatever. And so I had a little short story, and I started What If a Fish, which I took the emotional core, I called it, and just stole it all from my memoir, from my real life, and just like put everything that I loved about my memoir into the middle grade novel. And then when I started querying the middle grade novel, out of the blue, a university press contacted me and asked what I had, and I sent them both memoir manuscripts and the middle grade manuscript, and they were like, oh, we'll publish everything. And I had it out at different places, and so I had to tell a couple different agents, I've got these people who want to publish this book, are you still interested? And a couple of them got really mad, like you said, Lisa, like, you're not supposed to do it like that. But I hadn't really set out to do it backwards, but so some agents were really mad at me for doing it backwards. But that's how I got my agent. That's how I got my book deal for my middle grade. And so I'm really grateful. And then I ended up getting my memoir published also. So it was sort of abandoned, and then I came back to it, and I was able to put it all together. And my abandoned manuscripts go in a folder called experiments because I feel like that like takes all the pressure off of it. So whenever I'm not sure if I'm going to go somewhere, it goes in the experiments folder, which also like Laurel, I don't have 80, but they tend to be picture books. Because I was a children's librarian for a while and did story time and was like, I want to write a picture book. And we're not there yet.
Yeah, they're very difficult to write. Oh my gosh, picture book, a good picture. Well, bad picture book manuscripts are really easy.
They're so easy. So
But
easy.
extraordinary picture books are really hard to write.
It's the one thing everybody thinks they can do, or lots of people, but it's really hard.
Oh, it's so hard. It's so difficult. And it occurs to me as we're talking about the folders on our computers. So we have sleeping, dead, and experiments. So if someone like came across our folders, they kind of makes you sound, Anika, kind of makes you sound like a mad scientist.
Ooh,
you know,
yes.
you have like
Yes.
experiments folder.
They're like heads over here and feet over here. Yeah.
And I like that you said emotional core, because when I teach, I use that phrase a lot, except I say emotional engine. Because I feel like the emotional engine is this is the engine, you know, powering. So it's interesting that you call the folder experiments, because Ron and Laurel both kind of alluded to this. And I want to talk about this so Laurel, you said that you kind of think of them as, I think you said process pieces.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit more about what am I trying to ask? How do you know the difference? What would you consider a process piece? And how do you know the difference between something that's a process piece and something that's going to become Orphan Island or whatever? You know what I mean?
I think that this is one of the really hard things about the job, is that like so much, I mean, before you ever publish, before you have an agent, before you have an editor, when it's just you in a room writing, whether you're 10 or 20 or whatever, like the arbiter of what's worth working on is you, right? And then this weird thing happens where you have these other people on your team and they become a big part of what you decide is worth publishing. And I really still struggle with that like that the idea that like, and I love my agent, I love my editor, but like the idea that my agent and editor who have a sense of the market and the readership and like what will make a living or, you know, whatever, that then becomes the sort of deciding factor in like what's worth working on. Because for me, this, I mean, if I were to show you guys, like my process also involves things that look like this, right? Like, and my editor doesn't ever see that stuff, but like this, you know, if I were to show you guys my messy desk, like there's so many little pieces of paper scribbled on and Post-it notes and little journals in my purse and like voice memos I've made to myself. And that's all process too, that like there's some point where the scribbles that I wrote down next to my bed when I was falling asleep last night, that then migrate in here, that then I scribble down in my journal, that then I maybe at some point flesh out and type up into a document. At some point, it starts to become a thing where I feel like I've invested a certain amount of time and energy in it. And now it can't die. Like now it has to go in the 80, you know, the book of picture books or whatever. For a novel, that feels different just because you're going to put years of work into it. Whereas the other things are lighter. But so I guess for me, if I'm being really honest, like it's a very gut level thing of like some books just feel true and real and important. And I recognize that my agent and my editor and Kirkus and the readers may not agree with me on that. And like they're in charge of maybe what sells. But I refuse to evaluate the work that doesn't get published as though it's a failure. Like that doesn't feel true to me. And I actually I think because we were going to do this panel, I just this week was going back through some old work. And partly because I've had a really hard time writing in the pandemic. And so I've been revisiting a lot of my older work and kind of going and looking back through it to sort of see if past Laurel had some smart ideas that I can't come up with right now. And I found this one picture book that I love called Home on the Highway. That's basically just a very slow meditation about what it's like to be on the highway at night when you're a kid, that I love. And I know that probably nobody wants to publish this book. Because it's not, you know, because it's slow, because it's quiet, because it's sort of old fashioned. But I think it's one of the best things I've ever written. And so I feel like that's the other piece of the conversation is like the value of the work can't be related to whether you can sell it or not. And so I don't want to think of that as an abandoned manuscript. That's a beautiful thing that I made that I'm really proud of. And I might like even read at a reading if I had the opportunity to, even though somebody maybe will never publish it.
Yes,
So,
I think that's a great point, because I feel like as once you get published, and maybe even when you're striving to get published, kind of like Lisa alluded to this, and I think we can all kind of relate in a way, is when you've decided, okay, I'm going to try to get an agent, the way you approach the work is a little different. And I feel like for me, the businessy side of my author brain is thinking, is this book that I'm working on going to sell? You know, how much time do I want to dedicate to it? But also then the creative side is like, okay, you can't write books just to sell. So it's kind of like this weird middle ground where you have to kind of figure out how to write the books that are true to you, that speak to you, that you care about, that can also sell, so that you can like eat and like make money and
totally. But
things.
I think that I'm working my way back toward where I started when I was a kid, or when I was just writing poems, where I want to re-embrace that part of myself, because I feel like that's just a part of the author. Like that, not the author, that's a part of the artist. And if I let go of that part of my brain and I get too absorbed in the idea of publishable, that like something else more essential dies in me, and I don't want to do that. So I'm like, I've been trying to figure out, like, maybe I need to set aside a certain amount of time every week that's for things I don't think I'll publish, you know, that's like just for writing.
I love that. In fact, I've been thinking about to embrace that, because I worry about that as well, that something is lost when you start selling books. You kind of lose, especially if you've been writing since you were a kid, as I have as well. You lose that sense of doing it for yourself. And one thing that I want to do this fall is maybe take like a workshop, a creative nonfiction workshop, because Annika, creative nonfiction terrifies me to my core, like memoirs. Memoirs like terrify me. Or taking a poetry workshop or something where I'm not necessarily planning to publish in that area, but I just want to do something for me that no one else will see. And so this kind of relates to what you were saying, Ron, about how you kind of said that you don't necessarily view those as abandoned either. They're more like learning how to write. So what do you feel like those abandoned manuscripts, or those sleeping manuscripts, or those dead manuscripts, how did they do that for you? Like, what did you learn from it as a writer?
Well, I know everybody has a different process, and people have outliners and pantsters and plotters, and Laurel was showing all the Post-it notes and stuff that she's got in the voice memos, and we can all relate to that. I have a heck of a time outlining and plotting, and I still don't have a real method for it. I'm a complete pantster. I just dive right in and see where the story takes me. So I think I had to write a lot of those abandoned manuscripts to understand how to structure a 3-act story. It's really simple answer. I mean, like I said, they were learning experiences. So they taught me how, like, you know, and it's funny because, you know, I don't know if you guys have had the same experience, but like, you know, we grow up with stories and films and they have a 3-act structure, but were you thinking about that when you were a kid, you know? So the first time I sat down to write a book, I didn't know anything about that stuff. And it just kind of naturally said, okay, well, at this point, something has to happen. Oh, there needs to be some kind of conflict here to go to the next part. And then you finish and you've got like a 3-act structure, and you don't really realize it. It's just something that's in your brain because we've seen these stories and seen these films since we were kids. So what those things, it just really taught me how to be a writer, really, because it was just all just, you know, I mean, sure, I've done a few workshops here and there. I don't have an English degree. I haven't done any kind of huge workshops. So for me, it's just all been just like by the seat of my pants, learning how to write a book. Books are the best teacher. I always tell kids, you know, books are the best teachers. Read, read, read. So I think what I took away from that is just learning how to be a writer, you know, learning how to tell a story, sharpening dialogue, setting a scene. You know, I always thought that the scene setting was something that came easily to me, very descriptive. I think I can do very descriptive kind of. And then it's like, well, that's great. All right. Yeah. Well, where's the rest of the story? You got to learn the other stuff too, you know. And I think that's why I would abandon some things, because it's like, oh man, these 5 pages, wow, this is awesome, dude. This is okay. Now what happens? I don't know, you know. So yeah, so it's just been teaching myself how to become a, you know. And Erin, I think we've even talked about this at one point. You know, like I'm working on something now, and I'm like really kind of stuck on it, and I'm like, I need to be working and increasing my word count. And then it's like, how did I write these other books? You know, like and then I look at my shelf, I've got 5 books up there, and I go, I don't know how it's like starting anew every time. You know, it's like, so anyway, that kind of veered off a little bit, but for me, you know, those manuscripts have been just stepping stones to finally learning how to really craft a story. You know.
Yes, and
Making
I think
a better writer.
Yes, and I think it's kind of, I mean, it's, you know, the old cliche, practice makes perfect, but I think a lot of writers, you kind of start off emulating, like you said, emulating the books that you're reading.
Right.
And that's one way that we learn, you know, how to write. And I'm so glad you said that about, you know, looking at your body of work and saying, how did I do that again? Because I do that all the time. Every single time I have a book coming out, I'm like, I wrote that. It's almost as if I didn't write it, if some other person wrote it. And I'm just out here, you know, perpetrating like I wrote the book and I didn't. You know, like it's such a weird thing. So I love when someone says something that validates my weird thoughts, because I'm like, how did I write those books? And then I try to remember, try to actively remember sitting and writing, and I'm like, I can't even remember sitting and writing. Maybe I'm possessed or something. I think it's so interesting.
It's weird.
Well, I think it's so interesting that you said that you don't plot out, because I have this, maybe this is a what do you want to call it? A stereotype about people who have like genre works like supernatural horror or science fiction. I always think that those things have to be plotted out. I don't know how you could find your way, but I guess you find your way, like you said, through writing things, and that's how you kind of like figure out your way through the forest.
You discover things along the way, and then, you know, then you get to page 200, you go, oh, now that thing that I just made up on page 20, you know, now it makes sense. You know, they're just these serendipitous moments, you know. I'm sure we've all had them. But yeah, so.
That's so
interesting.
interesting.
Outline. I need to become a better outline. So if anybody has any ideas on how to be a better outliner, let me know.
It certainly seems like it's working for you the way you're doing it.
That's what I was going to say. I think you're fine.
Yeah, but it's anxiety and it's stressful.
Well, it's stressful anyway. I mean, right? I mean, that's inescapable. Yeah. So, okay, Lisa. So kind of the same question for you. You know, you talked about how you struggle with the YA voice and have struggled with different, like, voice seems to be the thing. And I totally relate to that, because I feel like when I've abandoned manuscripts, for me anyway, I feel like it just doesn't feel right. It feels like I'm forcing something that's not natural, but I never regret any amount of time I spend writing anything. Even if I spend 6 months writing something and then it goes away and I never see it again, because to me, kind of like what Ron and Laurel are saying, I'm learning. So did you feel like, is that how you kind of feel about like discovering your writer voice? Do you feel like those manuscripts helped you do that?
Definitely. And man, I so see you, Ron. I was just, you know, like plus wanting pretty much everything you said. I'm like, yes, I am a disciple of yours, because it is so true for me, what you said. And, you know, it's funny because not only do I have abandoned manuscript, but for every book that I write, I have basically abandoned versions of those books. So I have so many versions of the same book that, you know, we can laughingly call them revisions, but I don't know if that's really the correct word. It's kind of a different book. And I, you know, it's just, oh no, that's wrong. Oh no, that's wrong. Let me start again. Let me start again. Let me start again. And I would like to think, I pray to God, Erin, like I'm learning as I go along, that I'm, if not getting better, that at least some of the bad habits are falling away, or that I'm recognizing them sooner. There was a book that I abandoned that I'm just kind of horrified by, because it's not so much that all of the writing was bad, but there was some really like problematic stuff in there that I didn't, at the time I was working on it, it didn't dawn on me. I was really fascinated by kids with ADHD, and I don't have a kid with ADHD. I often say that I personally have ADHD, but you know, it's been undiagnosed, so I can't technically claim that. But I was fascinated by it, wrote about it, didn't do any research, just was like basing it on things that like friends had said anecdotally. And then I looked back at it and was horrified. Now that's one I'm like, oh, that is deader than dead. Like that is like the stuff that you're just like, no, you know, there's no saving that. But even those, like I do think I learned so much from that. I think sometimes I learned from the worst ones, as odd as that may sound, in that seeing those problems and thankfully no one else seeing those problems, so they're just private, and going, oh, okay, like I can see why that didn't work. I can see what I was doing wrong. Unfortunately, I don't have like the same awareness of when I'm doing it right. And, you know, Erin, you made the comment about like not remembering, like sitting down and writing the book. And I have this moment that I'm still kind of embarrassed about, where I had a short piece published in an online magazine, and I actually wrote them to say, you know, you've changed my piece. Like who does that? Like I didn't write this paragraph in here. And they're like, yeah, you did. Like, this is what you sent us. And I was like, oh my God, like I have no memory of writing that. And I see that a lot in my work when I'm reading back through something and thinking, I can't remember that phrase at all. Like, where did that come from out of my brain? So I too, Ron, think that it's time for me to start moving from the pantsing world, because that is the big difference I've recognized with fantasy and contemporary, is that the fantasy, I'm very much a character writer, which works in contemporary. It is harder in fantasy to pull off just straight kind of character-driven stories. Something has to happen in fantasy. And so I'm still learning my way. You know, it's really hard that you can't abandon a book that is already sold. So I know that, like,
and I wouldn't advise it.
won't be abandoning this. I keep, you know, telling my agent, like, are we sure that, you know, 2 book deals are the way to go? Because like pre-selling something that you haven't even started writing is a little horrifying when you actually sit down to write and then go through that process of, I don't know how to write a book. I'm going to have to give the money back because I don't know how to do this.
Yeah, I mean, you can abandon it, but like Ron said, probably, can you? Yes. Should you? Probably not. Probably not. Okay, Anika, what about you? What have you learned about yourself as a writer or as a person? Because I feel like, Lisa, like the things that you said, I love those stories, because I have abandoned manuscripts with problematic material in it too, and have had the same reaction. And I feel like it helps us evolve as people, not just as writers, but as people, to be able to say, oh, that's a problem. I wrote that. And why did I write that? Why did I think that was okay to write? So, you know, Anika, what about you? What kind of takeaways have you had from some of your works?
Well, I think, I mean, even though I write contemporary, realistic contemporary, but I also think, just like Lisa was saying about fantasy, I think you can't write any book that's just about a character. Something has to happen. And so that's been one of my challenges with abandoned manuscripts, in that they've got these rich characters, but they're just like sitting around, exhibiting their interestingness, but they're not doing anything and nothing's happening to them. And then in my picture books, I think because I used to do story time, and where I did story time at the library, there was kids that spoke all different languages. And so it was really important that the books were very rhythmic and language driven and, super different from each other. And so I love like a language driven picture book. But again, there's no story then. So look, I think I have a problem with story. So I just realized things have to happen. And I never like things happening. Like even when I read books, I'm like, I just want everyone to be happy all the time. I don't like it when bad things happen to books I read or movies I watch. I would just like everyone to be happy all the time.
I love when bad things happen.
Oh yes. No. I don't like that.
I love when bad, and you know what, Anika, you like what you said about things need to be happening. That's something that I write in the margins of my students' manuscripts all the time. I'm like, we're sitting and thinking again, because there'll be like 10 or 15 pages where the character's just meandering like through the meadow thinking. And it's like, okay, it's not bad thinking, but let's see the character like interacting or doing stuff. You know what I mean? Like, you can't just think and meander for like 10 pages.
And part of that, I think, comes from my background in memoir, because that's what you do.
That makes sense.
Talk about what you think. So,
yes, that's why it's terrifying to me.
Yeah. Yes, you do. You have to talk about what you think. Talk about how you feel.
I'm not opening that wound anytime soon. I can tell you that. Okay. So we're coming up on time in a little bit, but I have a final question that I want to ask each of you, which is, do you have? Well, actually, I have two questions, but we don't have time for two questions. Okay. My questions are: is there one project? I'm going to just ask both questions, and you choose which one you want to answer briefly. One question is: when you look back at past writer you and present writer you, what are the biggest differences you see? So that's one of my questions. And then the other thing I'm curious about is there one abandoned manuscript that you keep coming back to that is just like calling your name? You don't have to tell us what it's about. You can be vague, but and what does that manuscript look like? So I just threw out a bunch of questions, but Laurel, I'm putting you on the spot to go first.
Well, I'm going to take the question a little bit sideways, but I had one and I rewrote it. And so this book, My Jasper June, which came out last year, which is part of why I wanted to do this panel, is that I had this experience of having a book that was an absolute failure. And I wrote it and I sent it to my agent and I was so excited. And she wrote back, and it's the only time she's ever said this. She said, I think you really need to just set this one aside. Like, I don't see a way forward. And she had more comments than that, but basically like, this book's done. And so I did, and then I took a big breather. I was feeling very frustrated. And then eventually I wrote Orphan Island, and that came out. And then once I was done with Orphan Island, I found I couldn't let it go. Like it was still, and it was exactly the problem we've been talking about. Like I struggle with plot also, but I loved Leah, and I didn't want to let Leah go. Like she was a character in my life, and I couldn't sort of abandon her, even though I was willing to abandon the book. And so I went back and I opened a blank document, and I just started the book over again without having read the old one. Like I didn't look at it. It had been years. And I just opened a blank document. And actually Colson Whitehead had said something to that effect. But like he always writes a book, sets it aside, and then like starts fresh. I don't know if that's true, or maybe I'm remembering it wrong. But anyway, I sat down with a fresh document and started the book again and rewrote it. And it came out very, very differently. But the characters are the same. The setting is the same. The sort of setup is the same. All the emotional stuff is the same. It's just the plot went in a different direction. And then I sent it back to my agent, and she was like, yep, sort of now it's a book. So that was my abandoned. So, I mean, I've definitely got other things that I love and will return to someday maybe, but this was the one.
I love that. It's like past Laurel and present Laurel coming together over an abandoned manuscript that turned out to be very successful. So you kind of answered both questions at once. Okay. Ron, what about you?
Very quickly, before I answer the question, I know we don't have a lot of time left. The thing that I wanted to save was this book, The Owls Have Come to Take Us Away, which is about aliens and a 12-year-old boy named Simon. Ooh, see the aliens. Anyway, I mined an abandoned manuscript and put it in this book because my character is writing a book, and segments of the abandoned manuscript is in this book.
That's so cool.
I love that. I've done that too, like pulling from abandoned manuscripts.
Yeah, the character's writing a book, which is a book that I didn't sell. So
It's really
anyway,
smart.
I'm not going to give away a whole lot, but I have this idea in my head. I don't know. I think it's going to be my literary fiction debut. But I want to write a book about, I'm not going to say anything, but it's about a boy who can turn into a faun from Greek mythology.
Ooh.
I don't know what else happens, but he can turn into a faun.
It's literary, and that's what happens.
Yeah, yeah. It's woody. It's like, okay. Do you know The Secret History by Donna Tartt?
Oh, I love that book.
Yeah, I've never read
it.
it. I know
feels
of
like
it.
that in my head a little bit.
Oh.
Anyway,
That's a very plotty book. I love that book.
That's all I can say about it. I don't know. It's Greek mythology. It's like a faun. I don't know what else happens, but he's got
like
legs and horns.
Interesting. Very interesting. Okay, what about you, Lisa?
Cool. So the book that I keep going back to, it is a YA. It is about a group of high school students who their high school gets swallowed up into a sinkhole. And I keep going like, it's the Breakfast Club meets like, any disaster movie you've ever seen. And I love it so much because the main character is such a mess. I mean, I have never met someone so messed up as this young woman. And then I see the commercial for this show that's starting called La Brea, and about this woman who gets like sucked into a sinkhole. And I grew up near the La Brea tar pits. So I feel like it is the universe's way of saying, take that manuscript back out. The world is ready for a group of kids falling into a sinkhole and not being able to get their way out and having lots of Breakfast Club moments as they try to survive. I'm like, the time has come.
The world is ready.
It's a new Goonies. It's a new Goonies.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, the world wasn't ready for how good your other book was, but they're ready for this book. They are ready. The time has come, the walrus said. Okay. Annika, what about you?
Well, Erin, I think you said you had anthropomorphic animals. I just have these two talking animals that I love them so dearly. And my agent was like, she didn't outright say like, no, this isn't a book, but so I feel like I'm working on something else right now, but I think that those two animals, I think they're going to pop up again somehow.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, anthropomorphic animals are difficult, but when they work well, and children love them and eat them up.
They do.
So for me, I'm going to say that one day, I don't know when that day will be, but I'm going to write a time travel book, and it's going to be amazing. Well, it might not be amazing, but it'll be a book, and I will have written it just so I can say that I time traveled, because I'm obsessed with this. But one day I'm going to have an original idea about time travel. We'll see. So thank you, everyone, for joining me. And thanks to everyone who's watching or listening. This was so fun. I could talk for a whole nother hour. And now I have ideas for like 5 other panels in my head based on the things that came up today. But that's for another time, maybe next year. So I want to say thank you to everyone, all you wonderful writers and friends, and all of you listening and watching at home. And thank you to Middle Ground Book Festival for another incredible year. It's such an incredible festival. I was part of it last year, I'm part of it this year, and the panels are amazing. So I hope everyone checks them all out. There's so many to choose from. So I want to say thank you and have a beautiful day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Ciao, ciao.